Welcome everyone. Welcome to another Saturday afternoon. At Krea, we believe that a deep engagement with our interwoven philosophy and approach will prepare students for the challenges the future holds, helping them unpack a complex and intricate tapestry of relationships among humans, machines, and nature in ways that will transform the world. Our journey in doing so goes beyond our concrete classrooms or prescribed curriculum. Our centers of learning bring to us experiences and perspectives from the world outside. As part of building this intellectual culture at Krea, we are delighted to have Swati Thiyagarajan as our guest speaker today, hosted by VENI The Ideas Place at Krea University. Thank you, Swati, for joining us from across the seas.
Thank you. Thank you.
I invite Akila to take us through the next part of this session. And please do remember to post your questions in the chat box of the conference. Over to you, Akila, and I will see you all at the end of the session.
Thank you so much, Kala. I'm Akila Ramnarayan, Chair of the Division of Literature and Arts at the School of Interwoven Arts and Sciences at Krea. I'm also the erstwhile Curator of Programming at VENI The Ideas Place. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Swati Thiyagarajan, a former environment editor at NDTV and one of the pathbreakers of the profession of environment journalism in India. Born Wild, the show she has scripted, directed, and presented, is the only conservation show to have had a 10-year run on a news channel. I'm looking right now at a copy of the book, and in it, Pranoy Roy says of the show Born Wild and its architect, Born Wild was the first show of its kind on prime time on a news channel. Swati made it possible for NDTV to push the envelope when others thought of environmental reporting as esoteric and arcane. The impact and the response was huge, and we decided to continue to focus on similar topics, and Born Wild grew into a path-breaking series. So Swati is a two-time winner of the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Environment Journalism, and she has also been honored with the Sanctuary Asia Award, Earth Hero Award, Carl Zeiss Award, and others for her reporting on wildlife conservation. She has directed a documentary film in 2012, The Animal Communicator, and published a book called Born Wild in 2017, in which she writes about the wildlife and conservation efforts she's encountered and been involved in for over 2 decades in the field. She currently works with the Sea Change Project, co-founded and spearheaded by naturalist filmmaker Craig Foster, on the conservation of the Great African Sea Forest. Moderating the session today is Bharat Sundaram, an assistant professor of environmental studies at Krea University in India. Dr. Sundaram is interested in how environment-society relationships determine and respond to biodiversity conservation practices. He was previously an assistant professor of human ecology at Nalanda University and completed his PhD from Manipal University. His current work includes the long-term monitoring of a social ecological system in the Western Ghats and a pan-Indian data-driven project on forests, human population, and biodiversity conservation. His research has been funded by the International Foundation for Science in Sweden, the International Social Science Council in France, and the National Geographic Society USA, which means he's a National Geographic explorer. Currently, Bharat works on an invasive species called Lantana camara, common lantana, a plant that was introduced into India from South America in the early 19th century. Thank you so much for moderating this session, Bharat. And if the brief conversation at yesterday's trial tech run is any indication, this VENI session is going to crackle with the kind of intensity and life that only 2 dogged environmentalists can bring to the plate. I'm really looking forward to it. And before I hand over to you, Bharat, to moderate the session and to close it out at the very end, I have one question for Swati. Swati, tell us where you are now and what you're doing. I am a big fan of your Instagram feed just because I love to see what you're looking at outside your window every day. So please let us into your life, albeit vicariously. Tell us what your typical day looks like. And perhaps you can also tell us about what has happened since the COVID crisis, how it's affected you, and perhaps vindicated your stance as a conservationist and human.
Okay. Thanks, Akila. Thanks, Kala. Thanks, Bharat. And thanks everyone on the Krea team for putting this together. So yeah, right now I live in Cape Town. I have been living here since 2008. After 2008, I still spent a lot of time going back to India to continue doing my Born Wild series and doing special campaigns and reports. But in the last few years, I've really concentrated my time and my work, I would say, here more in Cape Town. So Craig, my husband, co-founded the Sea Change Project about 8-9 years ago. And the Sea Change Project is a group of 7 of us, really, very like-minded individuals who believe very deeply in conservation as a whole and specific to where we are, which is the kelp forest right here on our doorstep. And we call it the Great African Sea Forest to differentiate it from kelp forests found in other parts of the world. To give everyone a brief introduction to kelp forests, these are floating underwater sea forests as productive as any tropical forest on land. Their carbon sequestration is incredible. They do long-term carbon sequestration because sometimes when the kelp is ripped out by storms, while some of it washes up on the beach, a lot of it floats out into the ocean and then it falls as debris into the deep benthic layer. So there's long-term carbon sequestration. In the way the plant is designed with the fronds on the top and the long stipe filled with air that allows it to float to the surface. And it's what we call the holdfast. It doesn't have roots. It has a holdfast system, the kelp here, which hangs on to rocky layers on the seabed. Because of this construct of the plant, it's food for many animals, it's home to many animals, it shelters many animals. So the kelp forest ecosystem is an immensely biodiverse ecosystem that feeds the rest of the ocean ecosystem. It is also recently been classified as one of 9 key ecosystems in oceans around the world that require a great amount of attention and regeneration, because if we can regenerate kelp forests, we can bring back oceans to original health by 2050. Of course, it's one of 9, which means corals is one of the big things. Seagrass would be another big thing. So there are various ocean ecosystems like this that have been considered key to bring oceans back to health. And this is, we fit in the space that we feel not enough is known about this forest around the world. Most people, when you mention kelp forest, think of, if they even have heard about it, they've probably heard about the kelp forest in California, for example. But these are forests that cover 1/4 of the world's coastlines. They found, which means in 25% of the Earth's ocean surface is covered by kelp forests. These are very interesting forests. So like here, they extend for about, right here in Southern Africa. So they extend for about 1,200 kilometers along our western coast up to Namibia. And they only extend out to about 100 meters into the ocean. So they're a near-shore ecosystem. They're not a far shore or a pelagic ecosystem. They're a near-shore ecosystem, which also, of course, then makes them more accessible or more right there if you need to go in and do what we do. And that's really our passion, because it's right there. It's on our doorstep. And the 7 of us, especially Craig, who made a promise 10 years ago to go into the water every single day and record everything that he saw to bring, information about this ecosystem out to the rest of the world. And the rest of us have since, over the years, have joined him. And I joined about 2-3 years ago, the Sea Change Project, and we work towards the conservation of this great African sea forest. But really what underpins our entire motivation to do this is the understanding that everything that we stand on, everything that we've built, all our human edifices stands on a ecological foundation. And if that ecological foundation starts to rock, as it has in the last couple of decades, well, we can see all the problems that we see. And for us, one of the approaches to this is that pure passion. If we can somehow translate through stories, through telling you stories about how we feel when we're in the water, how we feel when we're in the kelp forest, the stories we encounter with the animals that we see there, the stories that we encounter with both the good that's happening and the negative that is going on. But if we can tell these stories and we can tell it with the passion we feel, then hopefully we inspire people wherever you might be in the world to do what you can do for ecology on your doorstep. So that's really where we come from, this deep, deep nature immersion and nature connection, sort of reconnecting us. So our tagline for the Sea Change Project really is, remember you are wild, because we are all nature. we're not separate to nature. We're not an organism that lives outside of the system. We are nature. And that's really the premise from which the Sea Change Project operates. Yeah, so that's what I'm doing right now.
Thank you so much, Swati. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be here with you, and thank you so much for making the time to join us. I mean, it just occurred to me that when we went to the same school in Chennai, I wish we had actually known each other. It was several years apart. I'm sure that we overlapped for a few years, but look what you get. I mean, we're meeting here now, you several thousand kilometers away, and me sitting here in Sri City. So I think it's great. So thank you, Kala and Akhila, for putting this together. I think it's a really nice way to engage. Swati, I've been thinking a lot about writing about nature, about conservation, about biodiversity. And I find that the journey that you've gone through seems to be a very special one. You've like Akhila just mentioned, this whole thing of being an environmental journalist was something quite new to the Indian media ecosystem. I don't remember seeing anything like it till you came upon the scene and till you started writing and talking about much of the stuff that has become now quite widespread. So could you tell us a little bit more about your own journey as a conservation journalist or an environmental journalist?
Yeah. So I'm going to start by saying that so when I started, when I joined NDTV, that was in end of 1996, early 1997. I just finished my master's in literature, and I'd also finished my master's in communication at Jamia in Delhi. And the reason I went from literature to the communication school in Delhi was I've always been passionate about the environment. I was very lucky that my father's best friend, Siddharth Butch, who a lot of Chennaiites would probably know, he was an ornithologist and a photographer, and he spent many weekends with me when I was a child, almost from when I was 6 all the way through till I was about 15. We'd spend almost every weekend together in the Theosophical Society, and he would take me on these nature walks, and we'd talk not just about the natural history and the animals that we saw, but we talk about nature philosophy, what it means to be out in nature, what it means to relate to nature, what it means to actually feel it as the living planet around you. It's not a static something that you go to, but it's actually a living, breathing, sentient space around you in which you belong. And so for me, that was my training, if you will, from when I was very young. Without a plan of actually becoming an environmentalist at that time, because this now I'm talking about way back in 70s and 80s in Chennai, where I don't know if I didn't have the exposure like children would have today to so many wildlife films and documentaries and people out there in the wild that you thought that this could possibly be a career choice. But it was my passion, and I knew I would always have to stay with this because this was my happy place. And I knew that from when I was very young, that this was my incredibly happy place. So I realized very young that this is what I wanted to do. But the big question was how, and how do I do it, and where are the opportunities and all of that. By the time I got to college, of course, NDTV had established itself, World This Week had happened, and then they had sort of transitioned into doing news for Star News.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew there was some opportunity there. And by then, I had started watching a lot of documentaries and reading and all of it. And what I couldn't understand was, by the time I hit college, which was in the early 90s, I could already see there were problems with our environmental policies, the environment, with issues. This was not something that was only happened now. We could tell way back in the 90s that there was a problem already. And what I couldn't understand was I'd open the newspapers in the morning or see Doordarshan, or there were very few stories, unless there was some big horrendous headline because some disaster had happened. There was no continuous reporting on the environment or anything referencing the environment. And what I realized between doing literature and reading stories and doing communication and understanding what people and how people absorb information and look at things is, if you open the newspaper every day, you turn your TV on every day, and all your headlines are either about the economics or it's about terrorism, then you're going to think those are the two most important things on the planet, because that is what you're being bombarded with. Mm-hmm. And I suddenly realized that if no one was going to talk about the environment in that way, in that very sort of consolidated everyday way, then how do you get people to understand that this is an area of immense importance. Of course, wildlife documentaries and wildlife nature documentaries, there were fantastic people in India at the time doing amazing work. There was the Bedi brothers, and there was Ashish Chandola, and there was amazing people doing fantastic documentaries. Then of course we got stuff from the BBC because of Sir David Attenborough's work, and there were some magnificent stories and wildlife documentaries out there, but they weren't on the news. And I realized that the way people are geared is if you see something on the news, you tend to believe it's more immediate and it's more true. So my choice at the time was, should I go into pure natural history, which was also something I thought about. It's such a beautiful thing. You can spend years and months in a space and explore that space and bring so much out. Or do you do that daily, go in somewhere, look at what's happening and give people the fact, the bare minute, tell them like, this is what's happening in your backyard, in your house, in your country. This is what's going on, and please wake up and pay attention. So, which was fantastic when I joined NDTV and I got the opportunity to do that. It's great to be called a path breaker in this field, but there were some wonderful journalists doing very good work in print, I have to say. There weren't that many journalists doing work on television, because at the time there was also just really DD and then there was us. I have to say that the Alba brothers were doing a very good show called Living on the Edge at the time. So, you know, I can't say that I'm the first person who exploded onto TV and did some, there were wonderful people doing some wonderful work. But in terms of news, in terms of having an environment beat and really covering it visually and reporting it for the news in a very sustained, regular way, I would say, yes, NDTV, we did that first. Also, of course, we were the only channel at the time. But even after other channels came into play, we continued doing that because NDTV believed in that. And we had a passion for it. And I had a passion for it. And my bosses, Pranoy and Radhika, then let me do what I had to do. So that is how it started for me. So it's a childhood passion, very much a childhood direction, and then wonderful synergy of the universe where things opened up as I stepped out of and was ready to do it. Then I had the platform on which to do it. So yeah, so that's really how my journey went. What I'd like to say is when I started Born Wild with my colleague Gargi Rawat, who's still on NDTV and an anchor on NDTV, I couldn't have done it without her. And I had a camera person, Mandakini. We were the first all-women wildlife camera crew, I think, across the board, not just in India. There was just 3 of us, and we traveled the length and breadth of the country to places where a lot of people would be like, isn't it dangerous? And you're just a group of girls, and like, how are you going to go and what you're going to do and where are you going to stay? And, you know, all the logistics of that. And it was always wonderful and it worked out really well. Yeah.
Wow. That's just fantastic. Now I want to kind of switch tracks a bit and move to what you said about seascapes and sea forests. And, you know, one thing that keeps kind of niggling at my head is that even though you mentioned that we are a part of nature and we should treat ourselves as being an intrinsic part of nature, there are several things that we do to nature that is kind of it shows our power. You know, our power is much more than other organisms out there. And in that sense, there are really very few contexts or landscapes in the world where wildlife and humans do not come into some kind of interaction, and or even come into some kind of a negative interaction, which usually doesn't work out so well for the wildlife or for the biodiversity, right?
Yeah.
So this has obviously led to a lot of people arguing for ways to make this poor situation better. E.O. Wilson, for example, will argue that half the earth should be set aside for conservation of biodiversity. Emma Morris, on the other hand, will argue that we are living in a rambunctious garden where we are managers and we should be living or learn to live in a post-wild world. So what is your take on this whole debate, and where do you see yourself falling in this continuum?
So the one thing I will say is that the sort of, I would call it the Western paradigm of conservation that we have followed for the longest time. I'm not saying it hasn't had its successes. It has. You know, we created national parks and we created areas of protection, and we have maintained a certain level of biodiversity even through the enormous amounts of pressure we've put this planet under. So I'm not saying we didn't have those successes, but what it did end up doing, the Western paradigm, and it's faltering now, is because we cut people off from nature in a big way. We decided that a wild place means an inviolate space without people, and that it has to be people free, and you cannot have people on that landscape, and that is the only way to save the wild. In some cases, perhaps true, depending on how much damage happened to an ecosystem and how much time it perhaps needed to recover, in which time you didn't want to interfere with the processes that would allow it to recover. But I would argue that that was because the people by then, our habits had changed. Because if you really look at surveys and you look at science today, again, they look at over almost 35% of some of our most biodiverse areas and some of our most pristine virgin growth, old growth forests are in lands that are outside of national parks that belong to indigenous people. So it comes down to how do we engage with the landscape around us. And this is something I have seen over and over in traveling in India, especially because one of my great passions outside of what I'm doing with the oceans today is shared spaces. How do people and wildlife live on these shared landscapes? I mean, let's look at India. We, on average, we have between 400 to 500 people per square kilometer in this country. In some places, we're talking about 20,000 people a square kilometer. So these are challenges most countries in the world don't face. And yet we're a mega diverse country. We're only one of 17 mega diverse countries in the world with all of our problems and challenges. Even today in 2020, we're still a mega diverse country. We still have biodiversity hotspots, world biodiversity hotspots. We still have a level of endemism to our fauna and flora that you don't find anywhere else in the world. And we have megafauna in a way that most countries don't. I mean, which other country has everything from the rhino to the buffalo to the elephant to lions to tigers to a whole host of leopard species? You know, it's a megafauna. Cheek by jowl with people. So I think what I've noticed in my travels across the country is not whether people should be in a space or not. It's how people should behave in a space that they're in. And I find in places where people are accepting of the wild around them, I find in places where for generations they have inculcated this, and I wouldn't even call it tolerance, I would say inculcated a deep understanding of how everything in that landscape actually works together to keep that landscape functioning the way that it should. You will find the same animals, like leopards, if you take, for example, you will find leopards in places like Jawai and Bera. Not one person has been killed in generations of people living there. And these are not areas with no people. There are a lot of people. It's all pastoral lands. There are many, many shepherders with sheep and goats there. And it's all farmland and agricultural land. This is not national park, national forest. They've made it into a conservancy today simply because people in that landscape have learned to live with leopards. And because they've learned to live with the apex predator on that landscape and conflict is so minimal, the rest of the biodiversity on that landscape just blooms and grows so beautifully. And there's this wonderful balance, even as populations are growing and some challenges are coming in. But at least there's still this way people have of dealing with that landscape and dealing with that predator, where they accept each other in that space. You take the same animal in certain areas in Maharashtra, certain areas in Pauri Garhwal, or you go even further up, into the hills in Uttarakhand and places like that, you start seeing immense conflict. And this is because the people have really just not, it's either they've lost that generational connect, or people who've never lived there have moved in there and they're now living, or urbanization has swallowed forests to a point where people who are not forest dwellers in a sense because of poverty or whatever it is got pushed into living in these marginalized areas, and they have really no capacity to cope with those big animals, and one can't blame them. You know, I've been on shoots where I have met a father who literally a day before lost his child to a leopard. And that is not a situation in which I can, with my privileged lifestyle and where I come from, but I never have to confront a leopard in my backyard. It's not my space to tell him how to deal with that animal. If he has rage and he wants that animal killed, then that is how he feels. You know, I have no right to step in there and tell him he cannot feel that way. But I notice for most part, even in those situations in India, their first response is not to kill the animal. It's more like they literally just want people to listen to what they have to say. They want somebody to pay attention to what it is that they're going through. They just want a certain amount of empathy, a certain amount of immediate reaction to that problem. And we fail them on that every single time. And then the rage builds, and then it gets to this situation of conflict, and then it's this endless loop of killing that happens. So for me, that is what makes it interesting. Is it's not the human in the landscape that is the problem. It is our energy in the landscape that causes the problem or not. So I do agree with the E.O. Wilson thought process of 50% or half Earth. I do believe that, you know, if we could set aside half Earth, and I think we can, if we just shifted our paradigm slightly, we could. And we don't necessarily, again, have to set aside this 50% without people. We need to set the 50% aside without industry. And we need to set the 50% aside without linear projects and all of the development that we, so-called development that we think we're doing for our future wellness, which clearly is not, you know, helping anybody right now. So I do understand that philosophy, but I also agree with the idea that what we call the wild, the pristine wild, it's only in very, very few places in the world is there anything that is untouched. Even the ocean, you know, and we know more about Mars than we know about the depth of the ocean in terms of knowledge. Literally, that is how much we lack in knowledge about our oceans. But even the oceans, for all of its vastness, less than 4% of it is actually untouched by human activity. You know, so there's human activity everywhere. And over generations, if we go back, what we today think are wild spaces have been engineered in some way or form by millions and millions of humans that have come there before us and lived there before us, and hunter-gatherer groups that moved through. And so there has been, we have been great ecosystem engineers, for good or for bad. That's been our role as well on the landscape. So it's both. And I think that's where this very fascinating, for me particularly, comes in, which is understanding how do we share these spaces? Because more and more, that is really where we're going to find our biggest challenge, is can we share our spaces, and how can we share our spaces? So yeah, that's where I stand, Bharat. Yeah.
That's great. So I mean, even in this this conversation we had, you've been pretty critical about a certain mode of development or a certain mode of industrialization. And you know, when you refer to that particular incident of a leopard killing a child, and how that person was mostly crying out, and the community which is crying out to be heard, what occurred to me was, although you have been critical of the government, you also have this in your writing, this empathy to the ground level workers who work for conservation or who work for protected area management, right? So can you tell us about how you came to these thoughts?
Yeah. So I will start by saying, when I started out as a journalist initially, I was very much the other camp. I was very much wildlife for itself and people separate from wildlife. And I saw that as a big problem. I saw people as the problem. And, you know, because that's all my reading at the time and things that I'd seen. And I came in with that. And I realized very quickly that was a very arrogant point of view to take, because then what was I doing on a landscape? What gave me the right to walk into a forest? What gives me the right to be a tourist in some wilderness area? What gives me the right to say, oh, I love nature in this? What does that even mean? Because if I'm not living on the fringes of a forest, and if I don't have to confront tigers killing my cattle and leopards in my backyard, and I don't have to worry about being bitten by snakes, and having the monsoon flood my crops or flood my home, or crocodiles come in with flood waters, if I have to deal with none of that, of course I'm going to love nature. Like, what's so great about that? I mean, you know, what kind of a person would I be if I didn't, right? Because it's such a sanitized life that I live. It's such a privileged life that I live. So when I started my on-ground reports, and I started spending time on the ground, in the field, and meeting the people on both sides, the communities that live in the forest and the lower level staff of the forest department. I'm talking about the forest guards and the guides and the forest rangers. and you see what they're up against day in and day out, and you see what challenges they have, and you see the lives that they live, and yet you see that immense respect, tolerance, and understanding in a way that a dozen PhDs could not have taught me. It just shifts and shakes your worldview. You can't come back from that, because it shatters anything and everything you thought about yourself as there's some great savior who's come to tell people how to save a landscape. It's nonsense. It is people living on that landscape. It is people experiencing those experiences. It is people literally day to day seeing what they're seeing around them. They have the solutions. And the arrogance of thinking that they don't, and that I can go to some university and be educated and then go in there and tell them what to do. Yes, if I'm educated enough to understand the science and the ecosystem and the habitat and the species, of course I contribute a lot to the conservation. I'm not saying that that's not important, but imagine how much more could be done if I took that daily living experience into informing how I then came up with a policy or a solution for that area. So for me, the light, in a sense, it was a slow trickle, but it really, the bulb just completely like flashed on. The one time I was in a Kalandar village near Agra. I was doing a big story on sloth bears, a series of stories, because I had driven to Agra for some other story, and I saw these dancing bears on the road, and I was absolutely and completely horrified by it, because the conditions these bears were in, and the way that hot needles put through their nose, and the iron ring is sitting on that wound and it never really heals. And then, you know, there's a rope, rough rope that's attached to that iron ring, and it chafes their nostrils, you know, the whole time, and it never heals. And that's why when the Kalandar jerks the rope, he can keep control over. And a sloth bear is an incredibly strong animal. This is an animal that can take on a tiger. You know, an adult sloth bear can go face to face with a tiger. So the way it is controlled is by jerking on this rope, because that area is so sensitive, it's going to respond to that pain. Plus it's declawed, teeth are removed, etc., etc. So of course I was outraged. I thought this was incredibly cruel. I did these stories on how this entire practice must be halted. You know, there's unbelievable levels of cruelty. Why aren't people being arrested, etc., etc. Those were my stories. Then I was doing a follow-up story with, at the time, the Wildlife SOS had started doing some amazing work where they were working with the Kalandars into getting them to voluntarily surrender their bears, and then training the Kalandars for a different kind of livelihood, if you will. And you know, teaching them to do other things so it wouldn't compel them to then depend on the bear for livelihood. And so I'd come to do that story, and the afternoon I was in a Kalandar village, and I was sitting with a family, and I saw the family, and I could just tell that they were hungry, that they hadn't eaten. That it was a miserably poor, difficult life. And yes, the bear wasn't in great condition, but I will never forget the elder of the family. You know, the lady came out and she gave us all the little bit of tea that they had in the house, and she brought some rotis out. And I will never forget the elder sitting on that cot and tearing that roti into half so he could give half of it to his bear. And that's when I realized that what I see as immense cruelty and immense horror is from my very sanitized life. Because for me, the slightest thing is cruel. But for them, when their daily life is so hard, their bar on what is cruelty or not cruelty is way different. So, you know, it's a completely, and it just dawned on me that this is what they knew. This is what they'd done for generations. It's not like they'd been given any other opportunities. And the Kalandars, as we know, are minority community. It's not like they're going to have that much of an opportunity to do many things else. You know, their children don't have access to schools. They don't have access to healthcare. You know, they live hand by mouth existence, and this is all they know. And when Wildlife SOS was training them to do different things, like some of the women started tailoring shops, some of the men started driving auto rickshaws, some of the others were doing other kind of jobs, and they were giving in their bears voluntarily, and then their children started getting education. You just knew that this was the way to go. You have to work with the people. You know, it's very easy to sit in judgment. So that shift happened for me then. In the field, although there have been many, many times I've run up against absolutely shocking, obdurate Forest Department decisions. And I mean, really, Bharat, I'm sure you would know, considering you've been in the field and you've done all of this, it's absolutely maddening, some of the stuff that happens. But the staff on the ground, who do the patrolling, the people who follow the animals, the people who are maintaining order in that area, and the people who, you know, the immense challenges under which they do these jobs, and the passion with which they do them. Because, you know, every time I go into, I love walking with them, you know, when they do their patrols. I've spent the night in the patrolling hut, I've walked with them, and the joy they feel in those spaces, and the birds they can identify, the calls they know, the tracks they see, the stories they tell you. I mean, it's extraordinary. These are people with no uniforms, barely any proper shoes. They have maybe, out of maybe 15 of them, one man will have some old little boar kind of like gun. I don't even know what that's going to do against a charging tiger. I've met guards who've been mauled by tigers, but they'll tell me how it was their fault and not the tiger's fault, and that the tiger shouldn't be blamed. I met guards who'd lost friends to snake bites simply because they couldn't get to anti-venom in time. In monsoon, when they're patrolling the parks, they've lost their children to things like cerebral malaria because the park is flooded and they can't get out to get their children to a doctor in time. And a lot of them are daily wagers still. I've met some of them who've done the job for over 20 years, who are daily wagers, who know more than some stupid babu sitting in an office, you know, who's looking at my permit to let me in there. The guy who's been there 20 years, who's a daily wager, knows that forest 100 times better than this supposed guy who has a degree and come out of the Forest Service. And to me, one of the things that have really been appalling in the 20 years that I've done this is, how is it that we have all this regard for the army, and we have all this regard for the police, and we have such little regard for these people who are protecting our biodiversity? I mean, it's shocking to know that for Forest Service people, guards and guides, some of the most dangerous jobs, we are on a list. It's as dangerous for our guards as it is for people in the Congo and places like that, for rangers, death rate wise. And that's the number of people we lose. I mean, it is absolutely, it just stupefies me that we can be this country speaking about GDP growth and being the next great power after China and all this nonsense, and you can't give the people who are really protecting the treasure that's inside your borders the respect and the regard that they deserve. So yes, this has been a big one of my, I would say that this has, you know, I've had a massive axe to grind with this, and what I've seen on the ground with local communities and the guards, I've learned so much more from them than anything else that I've done, that I'm eternally grateful. Maybe
we don't see them, Swati, because they've been made invisible. Exactly. So when you look at wildlife tourism in India, if you look at any kind of nature tourism in India, you and I will know that actually the nature tourist in India is one who gets off a bus with 60 other people, goes to a small visitor center near a national park or a wildlife sanctuary, probably enjoys a small safari ride, and then goes home back to his small town or to the city nearby. But that's not what you see in the media. The media is full of very romanticized visuals of the landscape, about these charismatic animals doing all kinds of, you know, crazy things that you and I would be very lucky to see, right? It comes out of years and years of persevering to get that one shot. Yeah. But the mainstream media is largely full of these kinds of representations, right? So as a journalist who's been working with these kinds of issues and also seeing your journalistic world, your media world, do you think that has this changed any with these voices coming into the mainstream and being heard? Or is it just the same thing of them being invisibilized? What do you think? I think they're still invisible. I think there's some amazing journalists out there, fantastic colleagues of mine, you know, contemporaries of mine, a lot of them amazing, a lot of them women. Amazing work. Just off the top of my head, I know that Bahar and Prerna Brindra and Jay Majumdar and Neha Sinha and a whole host of them are doing fantastic work and bringing out a lot of the reality, you know, and a lot of them are very similar in the way they see things to how I see things as well. So, you know, I know that they do their work with a lot of sensitivity. But it's still a small number, and we still struggle to get these stories out, and we still struggle to find platforms that will put these stories on. You know, obviously, if you have a story with a tiger doing something spectacular, that is a more TRP or a visually worth story than is a story of
a forest guard who has spent 20 years tracking that very same tiger, who's lost his child, and, you know, as I said, to not being able to get him to a doctor, and all the hardships that he's gone through, and not even being confirmed labor, you know, and still living on a daily wage, which is just barely anything that he's paid. And she today, I mean, we have a lot of women as well now in the field of forest guards, like in Gir and other places, fantastic women who are doing this amazing work. So I think they're still largely invisible. That's one of the big, I would say, disappointments, or I would say that even I think if I were to look back on my body of work or my career, I would say even I have let them down in that sense. Should have possibly done a lot more. But you know, you get so dragged into so many stories and so many issues, and so much is going on, and news being in its own way the way that it is, while it's incredibly powerful to get people to watch something and believe in the immediacy of it, it's also this unbelievable 24/7 wheel, and it's constantly demanding more and more and more and more, and you just find yourself sort of spread out in this crazy way, just dashing from one story to the next. And unfortunately, also what happens in that sense is then you're only doing the headlines. So then you never really get the idea of what the story is behind the headline. And unfortunately, if all your headlines are about a mob beating a leopard to death, or somebody setting a sloth bear on fire, or you know, a tiger killing somebody, and then there's retaliatory killing or whatever, then for the regular audience watching it on TV, it's very much like, oh my God, look at those people, they're so insensitive. Or, oh my God, you know, how could they kill the tiger? Or that's how it goes, because you're just dashing from one headline to the next. I was lucky in terms of being able to do Born Wild, because I got that, at least I got 20 minutes in a landscape with a species in a system where I could look at all of the issues around that. So I was lucky, but I could have most certainly done more. I still want to do more. Other reporters are in the field, as I said, doing some wonderful work, but they can also do more. But there is this problem of the invisibility, but also it's the system in which we're also doing the reporting. You know, the problem is that unfortunately, newsrooms today are run, or the way it's now works is almost like a corporate setup. Costs have gone through the roof. You know, it's incredible how much to do a 1-minute story outside of, like, if you have to leave Delhi and go somewhere, especially for these environment stories, invariably have to travel quite a bit. By the time you get there with a camera person, you spend the time, you shoot the story. I mean, it's unbelievable amount of money you've spent. And what you will get for doing that, if you go do a Bollywood star, or if you go do a sports person, or you go do some other story, chances of even getting it sponsored are much higher. This is the other big problem, you know, like, we have to fight for every cent that we get, because somehow it's still in people's head, this environment thing is considered not mainstream, still something that people very gingerly kind of touch. You know, sponsors are very like, you wouldn't get them readily, let me put it this way, you know, lining up, if you would, to sponsor your environment journalism work. You might get them if you did an amazing pure natural history film, but even that, you know, it's difficult to get budgets for, and they have their own place. But certainly for news stories, it's challenging. So that was another big challenge. So your time is constrained, where you can go is constrained, what you can do is constrained, and you have to work within all of those challenges. So that's a big problem. And I find that the amount of money that what I call the other side puts into climate denying and pushing development as your future. And today, especially, anyone who talks about environment, or who questions what's happening, is either seen as an anti-national, or as an anti-development person, or as anti-this or anti-that. And in fact, the very fact that we can have a debate or a conversation around development versus you know, environment is absurd. You know, that shouldn't even exist in a sentence, because I don't even understand, but that is what they've done. I mean, the other side, as I call it, that's had the money and the power, they've created this narrative where it's seen as anyone who wants to save the environment is somebody who's automatically anti-development and therefore anti-people. It's very insidiously done, but it's been done very powerfully, and you're up against this the whole time.
So you've been super fortunate, I think, and I really envy you, because you have a lovely experience of knowing the landscape in India. And now getting to know or knowing the landscape where you are in Cape Town. India and South Africa are similar in some ways, but are very, very dissimilar in others.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so South Africa, just like India, is one of 7. So India and South Africa are both mega diverse countries. So India and South Africa are 2 of 17 mega diverse countries on the planet. So on that, we're very similar. Where we're not similar is all of South Africa is 50 million people, population-wise, 58 million, so say 60 million people, which is still a big population for South Africa because of its challenges. But that's just, I would think, probably the population of Tamil Nadu and Kerala put together in India or something, or less. I don't know, just Tamil Nadu. I don't know.
Delhi and Bangalore. Delhi, Bangalore.
Yeah, Delhi, Bangalore. There you go. So, and South Africa by size, almost if you place the country, it'll fit into at least a third of India. You know, just by sheer size. So from that perspective, of course, the population challenges, while there are population challenges here, not quite as drastic as in India in terms of space and habitat and people. South Africa also has, for its challenges, because, you know, apartheid devastated this country, and then post-apartheid, it's still been an incredible challenge to bring some level of equity to people here. We have millions of people way below the poverty line and living lives they shouldn't be living and facing challenges they shouldn't be facing. And the wealth is very much concentrated in the top 1%, and almost 80% of the land, privately owned land in this country, is in the hands of the top 1%. And 20 million people live in appalling conditions in this country. And so the country has the same level of challenges, I would say, when it comes to India, you know, in terms of having to get the economic momentum going and having to get its people jobs and, you know, put food on the table, etc. So one can appreciate and see what the challenges are for both countries. But at the same time, South Africa, having said that, in comparison to many countries, has strong environment laws and is quite good in how they've maintained their environment and you know, in how they face challenges. A lot of problems, plenty of problems. I mean, not saying there isn't corruption, both countries, a lot of corruption. I'm not saying, you know, licenses aren't handed out to the wrong people. I'm not saying that big pharma and big mines and big timber and big industrialized fishing, all of that, you know, yeah, absolutely. So from that point of view, it's quite similar, the challenges they face. The one other thing that's quite interesting about South Africa and India is, in South Africa, the local community, so the local indigenous communities so that would be the Bushmen, the San people of South Africa, their knowledge and understanding and being on the land is just like for our indigenous peoples in India, you know, when you look at the real forest dwelling communities and tribals. And so that's a very different equation. But for a lot of other people in South Africa, because apartheid for so many years and generations kind of separated them from the land, if you will, created these national park and inviolate spaces by throwing the people out. On top of it, added that burden of apartheid on the people, where they were treated as not just second class, but 5th, 10th, 15th class citizens, where they were almost equated with the wildlife, like as if they weren't even human. So they created this generational kind of separation from nature, where it's almost like today, if, you know, the Black community wants to stand up and reclaim nature, somewhere they created this horrendous idea of that being primitive, you know, because the white man is meant to have had this great civilization and culture that he brought to Africa, which is, you know, as we all know, is just utter rubbish and nonsense. You know, indigenous African wisdom, just general African wisdom, their expertise, their knowledge, the way they deal with life, it may be different to how someone might want to do it in Europe or America, but no less significant in value to how they do it here. But that separation over generations did create a schism. And of course, when you make people that desperate and you make them that marginalized, then they have to survive off the land around them. And then there is that much more hunting and that much more trapping and that much more. And on top of it, you've created this separation from nature. So it's this very bad cycle that you've gone and created. I would say that in India, luckily, I don't know if it's because even when the British were in charge, somehow our general, very fundamental ethos, our underpinning came from a kind of pantheism and a kind of worship of nature and a kind of living with it that perhaps didn't break it entirely and didn't do as much damage as they have here. But here also, you slowly, a lot of young Africans are some fantastic guides and scientists and doctors and environmentalists and naturalists, and that's the hope. The great hope is the younger generation who are stepping back into those roles and reclaiming, if you will, those roles that they had. And that's fantastic. It's such a great hope. You know, it's not some old white guy telling you what you should do with the environment, but it's a young Black person who decides how it should go, or a young colored person, you know, deciding how it should go. And that's really the hope. So even with us at Sea Change, you know, the 7 of us who go into the ocean every day, one of the big things we're working on right now, we're a young, small, not-for-profit, and so we're also struggling to get funding and all of that. But we have applied for funding, and one of our big things that we want to do is reconnect people with the ocean, because that's the other kind of disconnect that's happened. Just like you'll see in India, you know, there's not much of a culture of swimming and diving and all of that in the ocean. Most Indians really don't swim that well, and we don't have that. Again, with the younger generation, it's changing slowly today. But generally, culturally, we haven't had that, you know, that thing to be in the ocean. And, you know, so that's the same thing here with the culture here. Not the colored people, who are phenomenal. They've been the traditional fishermen, artisanal fishermen. They've always related to the ocean. But definitely in the Black culture, there hasn't been that, you know, association with the ocean. There's deep association with the ocean in terms of ancestral worship and in terms of history and story and mythology, but not physically to go and swim and be in the ocean. So for us, that's a great arm of Sea Change Project, where we want to work with a lot of the young marine biologists who are coming up now, African marine biologists, and sort of get them comfortable in the water and get them to become the ambassadors and spokespersons. So when they go back and speak to children in school, that they're speaking to children who are looking at them and seeing their own people speak to them, again, as opposed to some foreign person or a white person coming and telling them what to do. So yeah, so these are, I would say, I suppose, similar challenges. One thing I would say, which is a bit different in South Africa, is so if you have a tiger, I'm saying, if you have a lion killing somebody here or killing cattle, you can shoot the animal and get a permit after the fact. A lot of farmers will shoot leopards, they will shoot eagles, they will shoot lions, so that is something part of it. And I personally think, again, that's white culture, you know, the Western culture that's come in. That is something that happens a lot here, which luckily, so far in India, hasn't yet gotten there. I know it's happening in pockets, and I know that this government would love to call some of these animals, what do they call them, vermin, and allow for culling, and yeah, but I would say that's the one thing that luckily so far in India hasn't gotten to that level yet. Yeah.
Thank you, Swati. That is just fab. And I think we just have a few minutes left, so I kind of want you to end on telling us what you have in mind for the younger generation, right? I mean, we are in a post-development debate where we don't want to destroy our environment at the cost of our future lives, which are going to be impoverished anyway if we don't have an environment to live in. And at the same time, you know, we are, you only have to pick up a newspaper in India or look at TV to figure out what, or rather how not government policy should be employed to protect the environment. So what I encounter often in the classroom is a certain level of, you know, apathy or even a loss of hope. So where do you think, you know, what role do you see young people playing, and what do you see the role of citizenship itself in trying to make things improve in the future?
Yeah. So I'm going to quote one of my great heroes. I was very lucky to interview Sir David Attenborough a few years ago. And I asked him, you know, because this was just before his 90th birthday. So I basically said to him, I said, you've been doing this for over 60 years and things are worse than they've ever been before. Like, do you not feel like after 60 years of doing what you did, do you not feel disheartened, you know, apathetic, all of this? And he just said to me, he said, imagine how much worse things could have been if we hadn't fought. And that to me is really where it is. Apathy, you should never feel it, because as long as there is life, there is hope. We still have incredible ecosystems. We still have incredible biodiversity. We still have wonderful landscapes, and we still have people who care. We really do. It just requires a certain amount of different kind of thinking, a certain sensitivity to what it is that we're doing. Let's face it, this hyper-capitalistic system that we've created, you look what COVID has done to it. I mean, it's collapsed without a trace. There isn't a bit of it that has stood up to this and said, okay, like this, you know, I can take this much pressure. It has just collapsed. So what are we creating these systems for then? If these systems can't stand for us in a time of need, what are we creating them for? You know, so it's mind-boggling. So that is something we really need to think about. You take India itself. This morning I read about the Indus river dolphin being spotted in the Beas River after I don't know how many years. And the Pollution Control Board has said the Beas is no longer a polluted river. The Ganga has been certified drinkable in certain areas of Rishikesh and Haridwar. The Yamuna is flowing without a toxic sludge. The Dhauladars are visible from Jalandhar. You know, I mean, these kind of things where what we see, and I'm not saying these are unique and unusual, but what is absolute fact is that this is happening for only one reason and one only. Industrial activity has been brought to a grinding halt. So we know that industries are your number one polluter and your number one problem. There isn't even a fig leaf behind which you can now hide this fact. And I think to go forward without having very, very stringent and strong laws in place on the polluter pays principle and on the precautionary principle, and ensuring that whatever is done after very, very scrutinized environment and impact assessments, is something, it's a complete disservice, and it is absolutely an insult to anyone and everyone who died from COVID, who are suffering from COVID. I mean, it would be an absolute insult, because we're saying like, yeah, it doesn't matter that you lost your life and your livelihoods and your, basic way to like survive. We don't really care. We're going to go back to business as usual, or even worse than business as usual. It would be an absolute disgrace. So where the youth come in is, this is your world. There is no other plan B. It's not like you're going to step off this planet and go somewhere else. This is it. So do you want to sit back and feel like, what can I do? Or do something, stand up, be informed. Today we live in a world of a lot of information. Inform yourself, know what your laws are, know what your rights are. See what the new draft EIA is about. If you Google it, it comes up, it shows you exactly what they want to do to dilute it. Sign that letter. You have until the 30th of June to make sure that this draft EIA does not get to go through the form that it is in. Fight for your rights, like ask the right questions. I think giving up hope is just, completely hopeless, because what are we here for? Why do we have the faculties we have and the opportunities we have, especially those of us who can make the right choices? There are many, many people who are devastated right now and they're probably thinking about how to feed their child next and can't stop to think about the environment, but you and I can. And if we don't, that's a complete disservice. So that's what I would say, is that, don't give up that hope, because even in the midst of this, look at the ability for nature to regenerate. Look at the ability for rewilding to happen. Look at what we can actually do. Look at what we've done to save lives. That itself is a wonderful thing. Who would have thought we'd shut down world economies to save lives, right? I mean, that's a great humanity type like step that we've taken. So if we have to do it again for climate change tomorrow, we can. These are wonderful, these are the positives to take away from this. And I think that we can never step away from that. We can never step away from the positive and the hope, because when I've seen people who've lost everything, when elephants have rampaged through their homes and their children have died and they're still getting up the next day and doing what they have to do, we have zero excuse to not have hope and do what we have to do. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Swati. And I would like to hand over to Kala now, who's going to be moderating the Q&A and the discussion. Over to you, Kala.
Thank you, Swati. I mean, that energy, I think, was at that consistent high octave, and, it's fantastic, fascinating, and lovely to see that passion. We did have a couple of questions, but I'm quite aware that in the last 10 minutes, you've touched on, this comes from one of our students in the undergraduate school, shares, who asks about the communities that you mentioned who have learned to live in harmony with wildlife. What can we learn from their behaviors and strategies? How are they able to do it? And how do we end up seeing them as predators? So anything that you observed?
Yeah, so what they do is they accept the animal for who and what she is for example. So let's say there's a community living with leopards. They understand that she's a predator. So the first thing they do is figure out everything about her. Now, she's figured out everything about the community. She knows them like you would know your neighbor. Just like you would know your next door neighbor listens to Carnatic music in the morning, uncle goes for a walk at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to the park, you know, the upstairs auntie does something else at 10 o'clock at night. You know all this, right? That's how you navigate your urban environment. You know, if the red, you know, the light is red, don't cross the road. If it's like green, you know, like that kind of thing. That's how you navigate your environment. And the way these communities do it is they understand their landscape and the animals on their landscape exactly like that. They'll know where this leopard normally moves around. They'll know at what time she moves around. They'll know, you know, and they will adjust their behavior according to how she moves around. And that synergy, there is a feedback loop, because remember, you're dealing with an incredibly sentient being. The leopard in itself is a very sentient being. You're also dealing with a very sentient landscape. A landscape is not just a dead thing with trees around you. It's trees that have a root system, that have a fungus system, that help them communicate to other trees, that help them, you know, protect a forest biodiversity, to which this leopard is the apex predator. That entire system is taken millions of years to form. It's got an intelligence that you have to respect. So when your response to that system is positive, there is a positive feedback loop. And feedback loops are something that have been established by science for a long, long time, and how these feedback loops work. So that's what we can learn from those local communities, is that learn it. So if you are lucky enough to be in a space with green space around you, figure out 5 trees around you, figure out 5 birds around you, you know, figure out what they do in the mornings, what are they doing in the evenings, what is this tree, what do I call it, you know, just be open to this living sentience around you. And that's really what we can learn from them, is to constantly adjust. Don't chase that lizard in your house out. He or she is eating the insects in your house, you know, very, very crucial. You know, don't kill the snake in your garden. It's doing its own thing. It's never, ever, probably ever, you know, going to bite you. You know, leave it alone. You know, if there are jackals, or you live in Mumbai and there are leopards, just learn to these animals, learn their way of being, just like you would a neighbor or a family member, and, you know, proceed like that. That's really what you can learn from the local communities.
Thank you. This question comes from Akshay. Akshay is from our Office of Student Life, who works a lot with students, and his question is more on environment education in schools and colleges. Yeah. How do we bring you know, context of local wisdom and traditional knowledge into curriculum, and how do you kind of blend that? Because, you know, you alluded to this bit about learning the textbooks and not really being aware. Is there anything that you can think as examples, or you think, you know, how they could seamlessly interact with each other?
Yeah, I think in one way, that way science has done an immense disservice to indigenous knowledge. Recently, there was a paper out of Australia where a group of scientists studied raptors actually setting fires. Mm-hmm. So they were picking up burning twigs after a lightning strike, or something that they could see caught in ember, and they were dropping it in places and setting fires, because they know these fires flush out animals. And then they were catching these animals. And this was not a new discovery by science. This was something the Aboriginal people of the area had been talking about for generations, years. And for the first time, a scientific paper was published, and they credited the Aboriginal community group that actually allowed for this paper to then, for the scientists to go in and study it in the way that they do and establish it as a paper. And they gave that community credit. A lot of the times when, you know, we'll hear about this great discovery someone has made of a new species or a new bird or something like that, 9 times out of 10, they've gone to a place and it's some local person who has said, oh yeah, they probably call it by a different name, and they don't even know it's something unique and extinct, because they see it. For them, it's a bird in the backyard. You know, it's only for some guy who comes from Washington or New York that it isn't a bird in the backyard. And then for him to get all the credit and not say that this is how I found it, or these are the people who helped me find it, or even to share credit. From that perspective, a lot of our discoveries and a lot of our science has done immense disservice to indigenous knowledge. And I think that there isn't enough attention being paid to recording indigenous stories and knowledge, because invariably when you go and you sit with them and you record these stories and you learn from them, you realize how much of what they say is actually something that's been translated later. Very quickly, I'll just tell you, when I spent time in Namibia with the San people, they spoke to me about this concept called the ropes to God. So they basically said, if I was in a garden and I noticed a little bird, when I notice that bird and the bird noticed me, a thread is formed between me and that bird. And then let's say I go into the garden every day and I notice the bird every day, that thread gets stronger. Then while I'm noticing the bird, I notice the plant it's on. I notice what it's eating. I notice other birds. I notice the predator that might come for this bird. I notice the mongoose that's in the corner of the garden. This way, hundreds of thousands of threads are forming from me to this landscape around me. And as stronger and stronger as these threads get, they form what the Bushmen call the ropes to God. And the ropes to God is what we call the web of life in science. This is something that's an 80,000-year-old tradition of explaining our human relationship with nature and how we are just one of the threads. And here we are, we'll talk about the apex predator and the pyramid and the web of life, and they have it all in their story. So I think that that's one of the things that hasn't been done enough, is the recording of indigenous knowledge and like bringing that out. And even if it's just a story, ultimately that's what people respond to. We all respond to stories. We want to hear stories. And I think that's the only way that I can think of doing it, is to either record those stories or have people who've spent time in those spaces come and tell those stories. Definitely don't discount that incredible knowledge. Yeah.
That's a great segue to the next questions. I'm kind of clubbing a couple of them from Kalpita and Shivani from our faculty group from the School of Interwoven Arts. So Shivani's question is about the extent of journalism that's out there. Has it been good or bad in a way? Has it misinformed us, or is it saying the right information? And Kalpita's question is about how has environment journalism impacted policy? Has it? And has there been any concrete examples of how this has positively impacted policy?
Yeah. So the journalism out there, as anything, there's been a lot of good journalism. There's been a lot of bad journalism. The bad journalism is always the tabloidy, sensational journalism, which I spoke about, those immediate headlines of mobs beating things to death, or, forest fires, or any of that, where there's no context to why any of this has happened. It's just the immediate headline, and then boom, you move on to the next thing. And where they, like, for example, the thing that still maddens me about a lot of this journalism is, even now, today, you will read stories, including in our own NTCA and our own environment ministries papers. You'll read gems like, this tiger strayed here or strayed there. It's like, what is this word stray when it comes to wild animals? It's absolutely maddening. They're not straying. They move. We move. They move. Why do we think that we can get on a plane in Chennai and go to Bangalore and that's okay, and a tiger shouldn't move from point A to point B, and if it does, it's straying? Every living thing moves. It's how we're designed. We're designed to move. So that kind of stupidity and inaccuracies and factually wrong stuff happens a lot. And that happens because you don't have a dedicated environment journalist on an environment beat. If it's a dedicated environment journalist, you'll never see this nonsense. But if it's somebody just chucked into a situation, I don't blame them. They're just being chucked into a situation where they go and ask questions and they don't know what counter question to ask, and they buy whatever stupidity comes out of the minister's mouth, and they come back and they put it straight out there, and there's no analysis, no background to what has happened. So of course there's rubbish journalism out there, there's no question. There's, as I said, but there's also some brilliant journalism out there. We're lucky today that if you read a report, check it against 3-4 different sources, see, which one works for you and how. And especially now with all this, fake news and all this. For example, now this COVID thing that's happening, the rubbish I have been reading about bats, utter and complete drivel that I've been reading about bats. Yes, bats carry many species of the coronavirus within them, but by God, you go buy a lottery ticket today and your chances of winning it are a lot higher than getting a virus from a bat. It's just absurd. Or the hysteria over sharks that happen when there's a shark attack, for example, like as if every shark in the ocean is just waiting to kill a human. I mean, this kind of absurdities that go on, where it demonizes certain species and demonizes certain things. And then also the certain species that we make so cute and so cuddly, at the cost of other species getting saved, which is also, ridiculous. So there's all of that. In terms of the other question, journalism and policy, of course, many stories, breaking news stories, many investigative journalism pieces, many stories that have gone on the ground and reported on things have most certainly changed policy. I remember when I did a story with my colleague Sampad in Odisha. This was about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. It was the 2 years of very, very bad Aribada, where the turtles were just dying in hundreds of thousands as they were coming in because the trawling was just out of control. And we did some very, very strong stories, and we got up to the ministerial level, and then they had the Coast Guard start to patrol the waters during the Aribada and, keeping an eye on trawlers. Then they brought in this rule that trawlers couldn't come into that space in Rishikulia and Gahidmata, I think, for about 5 kilometers distance when the Aribada was happening. And they also extended the boundary of the Bitarkanika sanctuary. So you can absolutely make a difference. Here in South Africa, last year, we had this octopus fishing happening in the bay where we swim and dive every day. And this octopus fishery was pulling out octopus. Anyway, that's a long story of why we had an issue with that. But what started happening was the trap used to kill octopus started killing whales. So whales were lunge diving in shallower waters for food. They were getting entangled in these ropes, and then they were drowning and dying. Terrible. And I personally saw 2 dead whales, and then I went out on the boat and I recorded the whole thing and I did a whole story. And then when I put the stories out, there was a lot of also other fantastic people, not just me, NGOs and organizations that fought against it. And we put enough pressure on the minister that she banned octopus fishing in False Bay. And we most certainly saved many, many lives of whales during that whale season. And even today, there are no octopus traps in this bay. And the areas where the traps are allowed, they have to be certified as whale proof, which means the equipment has to show that it will not entangle a whale. And if it does, the rule says that even if 1 whale gets entangled or trapped or dead, then the whole fishing will be called off. So yeah, so environment stories most certainly can make a difference.
Fabulous. I think we're kind of nearing time before I just hand it over to Bharat. Thank you so much. I mean, this is fascinating because the moment we started, I knew we were going to spill over for over an hour. And this was sure when we started. So I was kind of prepared for that. But this whole, the conceptually talking about what VENI tries to do is about the creativity and critical thinking. And we do have bright young minds at Krea, individually students interested in photography, in writing, passionate about the environment, of filming. And I can't think of a better space where all these minds can come together. And as you said, if it's about relying on the future generation, there cannot be a better place for these students to start. And importantly, listen from you, and as well as have people like Professor Bharat at the campus to work with them. With that, thank you so much, and over to Bharat for your concluding remarks and closure.
Thank you so much, Kala, and thank you so much, Swati, again for your time. I was just blown away by about the stories you told us today, and I think these stories are not just about the past, but can also become nice stories about our future. You told us about how you see this shutdown as having a lot of possibly positive impact going forward, and that we can take away positives from what we are going through right now. You have also told us about how we have to learn to fact check better, and that it is our responsibility to become better fact checkers. We are at a point in time in history where we have more access to information than we ever had access to before. But I think it's up to people like you who are doing amazing things for the landscapes around you, for universities like us, to make sure that people are aware of the various directions one can take if one wishes to engage with the environment or with ecology or with landscapes or with conservation in a rigorous kind of way. So I think I'll end by thanking you once again for your time. I mean, we've spent, like Kala said, gone way over time, and I'm happy that we have, because it's been a great discussion. So thank you so much, Swati.
Thank you, Bharat, and thank you, Kala. Yeah, it was great.